On the morning of March 14, 1853, the entire social order of Southside Virginia shattered with a single discovery. 23-year-old Catherine Dunmore, eldest daughter of one of the region's wealthiest tobacco planters, had vanished from her bedroom sometime during the night. With her disappeared Samuel, a 26-year-old enslaved man, valued in her father's ledgers at $1,200. But what terrified the community wasn't simply the flight itself. It was what searchers found hidden beneath loose floorboards in Catherine's chamber. 47 letters written in Samuel's hand, detailing not an abduction, but a meticulously planned escape that had been orchestrated for over 18 months. The implications were unspeakable. Authorities buried the evidence immediately, and for 170 years, the true story of what happened remained sealed in courthouse records, too scandalous to acknowledge. Until now. Before we continue with the story of Catherine Dunmore and the impossible choice that would destroy two families and reshape an entire county's understanding of loyalty, betrayal, and the terrible price of forbidden connection, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments below. Now let's discover what really happened in the spring of 1853, when the unthinkable became reality. The letters would tell only part of the story. The rest would emerge in testimonies given under duress, in whispered confessions, and in the horrifying discovery made 6 months later in a cabin 30 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line. Dunmore Hall stood 3 miles outside the town of Boydton, Virginia, a 2-story brick manor house that commanded views of rolling tobacco fields stretching toward the North Carolina border. The estate encompassed nearly 800 acres, worked by 53 enslaved people who lived in weathered cabins arranged in neat rows beyond the main house. Colonel James Dunmore, a widower since 1847, ran his plantation with military precision learned during his brief service in the Mexican War. His reputation throughout Mecklenburg County was unimpeachable. A church elder, a Mason, a man who paid his debts and kept his word. Catherine had been raised in this world of rigid certainty. After her mother's death from fever when Catherine was 17, she had assumed management of the household, overseeing the kitchen, the dairy, the gardens, and the domestic staff. She was known throughout the county as a capable, if somewhat reserved, young woman. She had refused 3 marriage proposals by the time she reached 21, a fact that caused considerable speculation among neighboring families. Her father indulged her independence, perhaps because she managed his household so efficiently, perhaps because he still mourned his wife and could not bear to send his daughter away. Samuel had come to Dunmore Hall in 1849, purchased from an estate sale in Richmond. His previous owner, a schoolmaster, had taught him to read and write before dying suddenly, leaving debts that forced his widow to sell her late husband's property. Colonel Dunmore bought Samuel specifically for his literacy, intending to use him as a clerk to manage plantation records and correspondence. It was unusual, even controversial, to have a literate enslaved person, but Colonel Dunmore believed in efficiency over tradition. For 2 years, Samuel worked in the small office attached to the main house, maintaining ledgers, copying letters, and managing the mundane paperwork of tobacco cultivation. He was quiet, meticulous, and careful never to presume beyond his assigned duties. He ate his meals alone, lived in a small room off the office rather than in the slave quarters, and kept himself apart from the other enslaved workers. Some resented his privileges, others simply ignored him. He existed in a strange, liminal space, too educated for field work, too enslaved for freedom. The Virginia of 1853 operated under rules as immutable as natural law. White and black occupied separate worlds, separated by laws that prescribed every interaction, every boundary, every consequence for transgression. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made the North less safe for runaways, with federal commissioners authorized to force the return of escaped slaves and punish anyone who aided them. Tensions between abolitionists and slave catchers had turned the border states into a battlefield of ideology and economics. In this landscape of rigid hierarchy, Catherine and Samuel's daily interactions had been unremarkable for nearly 2 years. She would bring household accounts for him to transcribe. He would prepare correspondence for her father's signature. They spoke only of practical matters, always in the presence of others, always maintaining the careful distance that society demanded. No one could say precisely when things changed, but sometime during the summer of 1851, conversations that should have remained brief began to extend. Questions about bookkeeping became discussions of literature. Samuel had read extensively during his years with the schoolmaster, Shakespeare, Milton, the classics that formed the foundation of educated thought. Catherine, educated by tutors but starved for intellectual companionship in the isolated plantation world, found herself drawn into discussions that began about plantation business and ended elsewhere entirely. By autumn of that year, Catherine had begun visiting the office more frequently, often in the evening hours when her father was occupied with his own business. She brought books from the house library, volumes her father never opened. Samuel would read passages aloud, his voice careful and measured, always stopping the moment anyone else approached. These sessions were never acknowledged openly. If questioned, Catherine would explain she was reviewing accounts. Samuel never spoke of them at all. The winter of 1851 passed without incident, but in the spring of 1852, something shifted. Catherine began appearing in the office with a troubled expression, her questions becoming more direct, more dangerous. She asked about Samuel's life before Dunmore Hall. She asked what he thought about the debates raging in Congress over slavery's expansion westward. She asked questions that could get him killed simply for answering honestly. Samuel's responses, recorded later in testimony, were always measured. He never forgot, could never afford to forget, the nature of their positions, but he answered. And in those answers, delivered in his precise, educated voice, Catherine began to see not the property her father's ledgers described, but something her world had taught her was impossible to acknowledge. By summer of 1852, the impossible had become undeniable. The exact nature of their relationship would be debated, disputed, and distorted in the months to come. But what cannot be denied is this. By August of that year, Catherine and Samuel had begun planning an escape that would require betraying everyone Catherine had ever known and risking both their lives in pursuit of something that had no name in the language of 1853 Virginia. The planning was meticulous. Samuel, with access to plantation records, knew exactly how much cash Colonel Dunmore kept in the house safe. He knew the schedule of the night watchmen who patrolled the slave quarters. He knew which routes north were most heavily monitored by slave catchers and which were less traveled. Catherine contributed knowledge Samuel could never have obtained. The social calendar of the county's elite families, the timing of her father's business trips, the layout of the main house's interior. They corresponded through letters hidden in the false bottom of the accounts ledger, a space Samuel had carefully constructed during the long winter evenings. Catherine would leave her letters there when she brought the household accounts. Samuel would reply, and she would retrieve his responses the following day. It was incredibly dangerous. Discovery would mean Samuel's certain death, and Catherine's social destruction. But they continued. Through autumn and into winter, the letters accumulated. 47 in total, each one more detailed, more intimate, more damning than the last. They discussed routes and timing. They discussed Quaker families rumored to help fugitives. They discussed the practical necessities of travel and the philosophical implications of their choice. And in the language carefully coded to obscure their true meaning, should the letters be discovered, they discussed why they were willing to risk everything for something Virginia law said could not exist. By March 1853, every detail was in place. Colonel Dunmore would travel to Richmond on the 13th for tobacco negotiations. The house would be managed by the elderly housekeeper, who retired early every night. The night watchman changed his route at predictable intervals. Samuel had secretly copied a key to the house safe months earlier. Catherine had sewn traveling clothes and packed them in a trunk she claimed held winter garments being sent to poor relations in Tennessee. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that they were not the only ones planning something that spring. And the secret they were so carefully guarding was just one layer of a deception that ran much deeper than either of them imagined. The night of March 13th, 1853, was moonless and cold, with the kind of darkness that swallows sound and makes familiar landscapes alien. Colonel Dunmore had departed for Richmond that morning as planned, riding in his carriage with his manservant, a journey that would keep him away for 3 days. The house settled into its evening routine with mechanical predictability. Catherine retired to her room at 9 o'clock, as was her custom. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hawthorne, checked on her briefly before heading to her own quarters in the back wing. The house grew quiet. Downstairs, Samuel completed his evening tasks, banking the fire in the office and arranging the next day's correspondence on Colonel Dunmore's desk. To any observer, it was an evening like any other. What happened next would have to be reconstructed from evidence and testimony, as there were no witnesses to the actual departure. Sometime between 10 o'clock and midnight, Samuel moved through the darkened house with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every step. He used his copied key to open the safe in Colonel Dunmore's study, removing approximately $300 in gold and paper currency, not the full amount, but enough to fund their journey without making the theft immediately obvious. Catherine, meanwhile, had not undressed for bed. She wore traveling clothes beneath her nightgown, and her packed trunk waited in the wardrobe. At the appointed time, they had synchronized their pocket watches weeks earlier. She descended the servants' staircase that led from her room to the rear of the house, avoiding the main stairs where a creaking board on the 3rd step might betray her movement. They met in the summer kitchen, a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway. Samuel had prepared a small wagon earlier, claiming he needed to transport documents to town the following morning. It waited now behind the kitchen, loaded with supplies hidden beneath canvas. According to the reconstruction investigators later performed, they left Dunmore Hall on foot, pulling the small wagon behind them, taking a path through the tobacco fields that kept them away from the main road and the slave quarters. The night watchman, making his rounds, saw nothing. The dogs, familiar with both Catherine and Samuel, did not bark. By dawn, they were 15 miles north, having abandoned the wagon in a ravine and continued on foot through dense forest. They followed a route Samuel had carefully planned, using landmarks he had memorized from maps in the office, specific creek crossings, distinctive rock formations, the ruins of an old mill. The discovery came at 7 o'clock the following morning when Mrs. Hawthorne knocked on Catherine's bedroom door to wake her and received no response. Opening the door, she found the bed empty, clearly not slept in. The wardrobe stood open, and the trunk that should have been there was gone. Mrs. Hawthorne's first thought was that Catherine had been taken ill and gone to stay with neighbors, but something about the scene troubled her. She descended to the main house and found Samuel's room similarly empty. His few possessions remained, but he was gone. With growing alarm, she checked the office and discovered the correspondence from the previous day still unsent, highly unusual for Samuel's meticulous habits. When she reported this to the overseer, a crude man named Taggart, who managed the field workers, he immediately suspected Samuel had run. A quick check of Catherine's room revealed no signs of struggle, and the discovery that her traveling clothes and personal items were missing transformed concern into horror. Taggart rode immediately to the neighboring plantation, where he sent riders in multiple directions, one to Richmond to inform Colonel Dunmore, others to alert the county magistrate and organize a search party. By noon, 25 men had assembled at Dunmore Hall, and the true nature of the situation began to emerge. It was Taggart who found the letters. Searching Samuel's room for any clue to his destination, he discovered the false bottom in the account's ledger that Samuel had failed to destroy in his haste. The letters inside, written in Samuel's distinctive hand and addressing Catherine with an intimacy that made the searchers recoil in shock, left no doubt that this was not an abduction, but a planned escape. The magistrate, a thin man named Howell, who had known Catherine since childhood, read 3 of the letters before ordering them sealed. What he had read, coded language that still made the relationship's nature unmistakable, represented a scandal that could destroy not just the Dunmore family, but the social foundations everyone depended upon. He gathered the letters, locked them in his saddlebag, and made a decision that would be debated for years after. The official story became simple. Samuel had kidnapped Catherine and fled north, likely intending to sell her to abolitionists who would use her as propaganda against the Southern way of life. It was a kidnapping, nothing more. The letters, Howell declared, were forged by Samuel to cast suspicion on Catherine and cover his crime. But everyone who had read those letters knew the truth, and that truth was too dangerous to acknowledge. Colonel Dunmore returned from Richmond on the evening of March 15th, riding through the night after receiving word. He found his home transformed into the headquarters of a manhunt, with men camped in his fields and horses tied to every available post. Taggart met him at the door and delivered the news with careful phrasing, emphasizing the kidnapping narrative. Colonel Dunmore listened in silence, his face carved from stone. He asked one question: "Where are the letters?" When shown them, he read each one in complete silence. When he finished, he looked at Magistrate Howell and said only, "Burn them." Howell hesitated. "Colonel, these are evidence." "Burn them," Colonel Dunmore repeated, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Or I will." The letters were not burned. Howell had them copied first, in secret, before sealing the originals in the courthouse vault. The copies he kept locked in his personal safe, insurance against a future he suspected would need the truth, however painful. The search parties fanned out across Virginia, following reported sightings and rumored routes. Catherine and Samuel, meanwhile, had already crossed into North Carolina, moving through a landscape that seemed to grow more dangerous with each mile. They traveled at night, hid during the day, and relied on a network of contacts that Samuel had painstakingly researched. Quaker families, free black communities, and sympathetic farmers who asked no questions. But they were not alone in the landscape. Behind them came not just the official search parties, but something far more dangerous. Slave catchers who had read about the reward Colonel Dunmore had posted: $500 for Samuel's return, dead or alive, and $1,000 for information leading to Catherine's safe recovery. The reward notice, distributed across 3 states, carefully maintained the kidnapping narrative. But the amounts told their own story. No one posted such sums for a simple runaway and his victim. What neither Catherine nor Samuel knew, what they couldn't have known, was that the letters Howell had sealed contained information that made their escape infinitely more complex than anyone suspected. And back at Dunmore Hall, as the investigation continued, searchers would make a discovery in Catherine's room that would transform the scandal from merely shocking to absolutely catastrophic. The discovery came 3 days after the flight, when Mrs. Hawthorne, cleaning Catherine's room with the desperate energy of someone trying to restore order to chaos, found a loose floorboard beneath the bedside table. Prying it up, she discovered a small wooden box containing items that made her cry out in shock. Inside the box, a daguerreotype of Samuel, clearly commissioned secretly, as no photographer in Mecklenburg County would have created such an image. Beside it, a woman's wedding ring, simple gold, sized for Catherine's finger. And beneath these, a letter in Catherine's own handwriting, unfinished, dated 2 weeks before the escape. Mrs. Hawthorne read only the first lines before dropping it as if burned. "Dearest Samuel," it began, "by the time you read this, we will either have succeeded in our flight or perished in the attempt. But I write this to leave a record, should we fail, of the truth that Virginia law prevents us from speaking. The child I carry is yours." The letter was never completed. What Catherine had intended to write in the rest of that letter, what she had planned to do with it, would never be known. But its existence transformed everything. This was not simply a flight for freedom or even a forbidden romance. This was a woman fleeing with the father of her unborn child, A child that Virginia law would have automatically enslaved at birth. A child whose very existence would have been an abomination to the society that birthed them both. Mrs. Hawthorne brought the box to Taggart with trembling hands. He brought it to Magistrate Howell. Howell, reading the unfinished letter, made a decision that would haunt him until his death 23 years later. He placed the contents back in the box, sealed it, and locked it in the courthouse vault alongside the letters. Then he returned to Dunmore Hall and told Colonel Dunmore in private exactly what had been found. What Colonel Dunmore did next would become the subject of whispered speculation for generations. He ordered every searcher from his property immediately. He canceled the reward. He sent word to every contact in Virginia, North Carolina, and beyond that the search was over. His daughter, he announced, had died, taken ill suddenly and buried in an unmarked grave to avoid scandal. Samuel, he claimed, had been found dead 2 counties away, shot while resisting capture. Both statements were lies, but they were lies that protected something Colonel Dunmore valued more than truth: the reputation of his family and the social order he had spent his life upholding. Better to claim his daughter dead than to acknowledge what she had done. Better to invent an ending than to allow the real story to continue. But Catherine and Samuel were still alive, still moving north through a landscape that had become exponentially more dangerous, not because of pursuit, which had suddenly, mysteriously ceased, but because of what they carried with them. A secret that grew with each passing day, a life that represented the complete destruction of every rule their world was built upon. The abrupt end to the official search created more questions than it answered. In taverns and parlors across Mecklenburg County, people whispered about Colonel Dunmore's strange behavior. Some believed his story about Catherine's death. Others suspected she had been hidden away in an asylum, her mind broken by the ordeal. The most cynical suggested that Dunmore had paid bounty hunters privately to handle the matter quietly, away from public scrutiny. Magistrate Howell, sworn to secrecy but burdened by conscience, maintained the official narrative while privately documenting every piece of evidence he could gather. His personal journals, discovered after his death in 1876, reveal a man torn between duty to his friend and horror at the truth he was concealing. In an entry dated April 3, 1853, he wrote, "I have today sealed evidence of a crime that is no crime, of a love that is no love, of a child that cannot exist in the eyes of God or law. May the Lord forgive me for hiding truth, but may he also forgive me if I reveal it." At Dunmore Hall, life attempted to return to normal, but the plantation bore the marks of what had happened. Colonel Dunmore dismissed Taggart within a week, paying him a substantial sum to leave Virginia and never speak of the case. Mrs. Hawthorne remained, but she grew increasingly withdrawn, spending hours in the chapel praying for Catherine's soul. The house itself seemed to mourn. Rooms that Catherine had managed stood empty and unused, her possessions packed away, her name spoken only in whispers, if at all. The enslaved population at Dunmore Hall understood more than the white family suspected. Samuel had been an outsider among them, but his literate status had made him valuable in ways the masters never recognized. He had written letters for those who couldn't write, read documents that affected their lives, and quietly shared information about the broader world. His disappearance with Catherine became a source of complex emotions. Some saw it as reckless and dangerous, inviting retaliation on all of them. Others viewed it as an impossible dream briefly realized. In the months that followed, rumors filtered back through the underground networks that connected enslaved communities across state lines. A couple matching Catherine and Samuel's description had been seen in Pennsylvania. Someone had sheltered them in a Quaker household near the Maryland border. A woman claiming to be a widow from Virginia had given birth in a boarding house in Philadelphia. These rumors reached Dunmore Hall through circuitous routes. A word passed from a traveling peddler to a kitchen worker, a letter delivered to the wrong address and quietly shared before being destroyed. Colonel Dunmore heard none of them, or if he did, he gave no sign. He had built a wall around the truth, and he maintained it with grim determination. But walls, however sturdy, cannot hold forever against the pressure of truth. And 6 months after Catherine and Samuel's flight, that truth would force its way into the light in a manner no one could have anticipated. The revelation began not in Virginia, but in a small town in southern Ohio called Ripley, a notorious stop on the Underground Railroad. In September 1853, a Presbyterian minister named John Rankin, known for his abolitionist activities, received a letter from Philadelphia. The letter, signed with a name Rankin didn't recognize, requested assistance in contacting certain parties in Virginia regarding a legal matter of inheritance. Rankin, suspicious of any communication that mentioned Virginia and inheritance in the same breath, common tricks used by slave catchers, initially ignored the letter. But a second letter arrived 2 weeks later, this one more explicit. It contained information that could only have come from someone intimately familiar with Mecklenburg County, Virginia, and it mentioned Colonel James Dunmore by name. Intrigued despite his caution, Rankin replied to a Philadelphia address, asking for clarification. What he received in return was a 9-page letter that detailed the events of March 1853 from Catherine's perspective, written in her own hand. The letter explained their flight, confirmed their marriage by a sympathetic minister in Pennsylvania, and detailed the birth of a daughter in August 1853. But the letter's primary purpose was neither explanation nor justification. Catherine was writing because Samuel was dead. He had died in early September, killed not by slave catchers or vengeful pursuers, but by typhoid fever contracted in the crowded Philadelphia boarding house where they had been living. Catherine, alone with an infant daughter in a city where she knew no one and possessed no family connections, was destitute. She was requesting that Rankin act as an intermediary to contact her father, to ask if any reconciliation might be possible, if he might acknowledge his granddaughter if not his daughter. Rankin, deeply moved and deeply troubled, faced an impossible decision. He believed in helping fugitives, but Catherine was not legally a fugitive. She had broken no law by leaving Virginia. Samuel had been, but Samuel was dead. The child, under Virginia law, would have been born into slavery, the property of Colonel Dunmore. But in Pennsylvania, she was free. What exactly was he being asked to facilitate? After much deliberation and prayer, Rankin wrote to Magistrate Howell, whom he knew by reputation to be a man of integrity if not abolitionist sympathies. His letter, carefully worded to avoid incriminating anyone, explained that he had been contacted by a young woman claiming to be Colonel Dunmore's daughter and asking if any reconciliation might be possible. Howell received the letter in late October 1853. He sat in his office for an hour, the letter on his desk, before finally deciding what he had to do. He rode to Dunmore Hall that same afternoon. Colonel Dunmore received him in the study where Samuel had once worked. Howell explained the situation as gently as possible, then waited for the response he dreaded. What Colonel Dunmore said, recorded in Howell's journal, was this: "I have no daughter. I have no. If this woman in Philadelphia persists in using my family name, inform her that I will pursue legal action for fraud. She is to contact me no further. Tell Rankin the same." Howell tried to reason with him. "James, she's your daughter, your grandchild." "I have no daughter," Colonel Dunmore repeated, his voice like iron. "And I have no grandchild. The matter is closed." Howell left, defeated, and wrote to Rankin explaining that reconciliation was impossible. He enclosed a small sum of his own money, asking Rankin to see it delivered to Catherine with his apologies for her father's response. Catherine's reply, when it came weeks later, was brief. She thanked Rankin and Howell for their attempts. She explained that she had found work as a seamstress and was managing barely to support herself and her daughter. She asked for no further assistance. The letter's final paragraph would be quoted in abolitionist newspapers for years after. "I knew, when I chose this path, that I was choosing to die to my former life. I did not anticipate how literal that death would be. But I would make the same choice again, because the alternative was a living death of the spirit that I could no longer endure. My daughter will grow up free, and that is worth any sacrifice." The letter found its way, through Rankin's connections, to abolitionist publications in Philadelphia and Boston. They printed it without Catherine's name, identifying her only as a young Virginia woman of good family who chose love and liberty over the comforts of slavery. The story spread, became part of abolitionist literature, was referenced in speeches and sermons. In Virginia, those who read these accounts and recognize the details maintained their silence. Colonel Dunmore never acknowledged the publications. Magistrate Howell kept his documentation locked away. Mrs. Hawthorne continued her prayers. The plantation worked its cycles of planting and harvest as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The social fabric that seemed so solid, so eternal, had revealed itself to be more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. If Colonel Dunmore's own daughter could choose the enslaved man over her birthright, what did that say about the system everyone depended upon? If love could transcend the barriers everyone insisted were natural and absolute, what else might prove less permanent than it appeared? These were dangerous questions, and they were not discussed openly. But they lingered in the silence, in the careful way people avoided mentioning Catherine's name, in the speed with which Colonel Dunmore aged over the following years. And in Philadelphia, Catherine Dunmore, she kept her name, refusing to hide her origin, raised her daughter in a 2-room apartment above a tailor's shop. She worked long hours at her sewing, attended a small Presbyterian church, and told her daughter stories about her father, carefully chosen stories that emphasized Samuel's intelligence, his kindness, his courage. The daughter, named Sarah, grew up knowing she was different, but not fully understanding why until she was older. She knew her father had died before she could know him. She knew her mother had left Virginia under difficult circumstances. She knew her grandfather refused to acknowledge their existence. What she didn't know, what Catherine never told her, a secret Catherine would carry to her grave, was the full complexity of the choice her parents had made, the network of deception and planning that had been required, and the contents of the sealed documents in the Mecklenburg County Courthouse that would remain hidden for another generation. Those documents stayed sealed until 1889, when Magistrate Howell's son, sorting through his father's effects after his death, discovered the copies of the letters and the unfinished note about Catherine's pregnancy. Shocked by what he read, he debated for weeks before finally deciding to make the documents public. By then, Catherine had been dead for 3 years, buried in a Philadelphia cemetery under a headstone that identified her simply as beloved mother. Colonel Dunmore had died in 1871, never having spoken his daughter's name again after 1853. Most of the principals were dead. The plantation system they had all been part of had collapsed in the Civil War, and the world that had made Catherine and Samuel's choice so impossible had transformed beyond recognition. When Howell's son published the letters in a Richmond newspaper, they caused a brief scandal, then faded into the archives of forgotten history. A few aging abolitionists wrote articles praising Catherine's courage. A few Southern apologists condemned her betrayal. But mostly, people read the story, shook their heads at the tragedy of it all, and moved on. What they didn't know, what the letters themselves couldn't reveal, was that the story they thought they knew was still incomplete. Because there had been one more letter, never sent, never read, and never included in the courthouse records. A letter that would have changed how everyone understood what had really happened in March 1853. That letter, written by Samuel in the weeks before their escape, had been hidden in a place no one thought to search. And it would remain hidden for another 60 years, until a renovation of the building that had once housed Samuel's office would reveal a space between the walls where a tin box had been carefully concealed. Inside that box, Samuel's letter, addressed to the one person who had made their escape possible, the one person whose role in the story had never been suspected. But that discovery was still decades away. In 1853, as winter approached and the scandal faded from immediate consciousness, the people of Mecklenburg County returned to their lives, convinced they understood what had happened even as the truth remained carefully buried beneath layers of deception, self-deception, and deliberate silence. The winter of 1853-54 brought unusual cold to Virginia, with ice storms that damaged tobacco plants and left the roads impassable for days at a time. At Dunmore Hall, Colonel Dunmore retreated increasingly into isolation, handling plantation business through his overseer and rarely venturing beyond his property. His health, robust despite his 62 years, began to decline visibly. He developed a persistent cough that Mrs. Hawthorne treated with various remedies, none effective. In Philadelphia, Catherine struggled through that same winter with challenges of a different sort. The seamstress work that had sustained her through autumn slowed dramatically as wealthy clients left the city for warmer climates. Sarah, not yet 6 months old, required constant care. The small sum Magistrate Howell had sent was gone, spent on rent and coal for the tiny stove that barely heated their rooms. Catherine wrote again to Rankin in January, not asking for charity but inquiring about positions as a governess or teacher. She had, she explained, received an excellent education and could teach music, literature, and French. Rankin, moved by her determination, contacted several Quaker families he knew, but the responses were polite refusals. A woman with Catherine's background, unmarried, her brief marriage to Samuel, performed by a minister without legal standing, was not recognized. With a mixed-race child, was unemployable in any position that involved entering respectable homes. What saved Catherine was not charity, but skill. A customer at the tailor's shop below her rooms, impressed by the quality of her work on a difficult repair, commissioned an entire wardrobe, then another. By spring, Catherine had developed a small but reliable clientele of women who appreciated fine needlework and didn't ask too many questions about her background. She was surviving, barely, but surviving nonetheless. In her letters to Rankin, which continued sporadically over the following year, she never complained. She wrote instead about Sarah's development, her first teeth, her first attempts at words. She wrote about the city, about the free black community she had cautiously begun to know, about the strange freedom of living without the constant surveillance of plantation society. "I am not happy," she wrote in April 1854, "but I am free to be unhappy in my own way, and that is a kind of happiness I never knew in Virginia. Sarah will grow up in a world that, while far from just, at least permits her existence. That is enough." But in Virginia, questions that should have been settled continued to surface. In the spring of 1854, a man appeared in Boydton claiming to be a journalist from Baltimore, researching stories about the Underground Railroad. He asked questions about the Dunmore case, about Catherine and Samuel, about the circumstances of their flight. Local authorities, warned by Magistrate Howell, refused to speak with him. He left after a week, but his presence had revived gossip that had finally begun to die down. Mrs. Hawthorne, questioned by Colonel Dunmore about what the journalist had been asking, reluctantly reported that he seemed particularly interested in Samuel, in his education and his role at the plantation. He had asked whether Samuel had family in Virginia, whether he had been known to associate with abolitionists, whether he had ever traveled north before his escape. These questions troubled Colonel Dunmore deeply. He had Samuel's personal effects, the few items left in his room, brought to the study. There was almost nothing. A Bible, some clothing, a few books. But tucked into the Bible was a single sheet of paper, folded small, that Dunmore hadn't noticed before. He unfolded it and found himself reading a letter in unfamiliar handwriting, addressed to Samuel, dated November 1852. The letter was brief and carefully worded. "Your inquiry is noted. The arrangement can be made as discussed, pending confirmation of the timing and route. Burn this upon receipt." It was unsigned. Colonel Dunmore read it 3 times, his expression growing darker with each reading. What arrangement? What route? He had assumed, everyone had assumed, that Catherine and Samuel had planned their escape alone, that it was an impulsive act of desperation or passion. But this letter suggested something different. Preparation, coordination, outside assistance arranged months in advance. He brought the letter to Magistrate Howell the next day. Howell examined it carefully, noting the paper quality, the handwriting style, the lack of any identifying marks. "This suggests," he said slowly, "that Samuel had contacts with the Underground Railroad well before March, that their escape wasn't spontaneous, but carefully coordinated with people who had experience moving fugitives north." "Who?" Colonel Dunmore demanded. "Who helped them?" Howell had no answer. The handwriting matched none of the known abolitionists operating in Virginia or North Carolina. The paper was common quality, available anywhere. There were no clues to pursue. But the discovery transformed their understanding of the case. If Samuel had outside help, if the escape was part of a larger network's operations, then everything they thought they knew needed reconsideration. Catherine might not have been a willing participant, but rather a victim of a sophisticated abduction scheme. The letters in her handwriting could have been forged or coerced. It was a comforting theory for Colonel Dunmore, and he embraced it eagerly. His daughter had been targeted by abolitionists, manipulated by a literate enslaved man who was working with outside agitators, and essentially kidnapped in a sophisticated plot to embarrass Virginia's planter class. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than the alternative. Magistrate Howell let him believe it, though his own journals reveal skepticism. The letters in Catherine's hand had been too detailed, too emotionally genuine to have been coerced, and the unfinished note about her pregnancy couldn't be explained away as abolitionist propaganda. But he said nothing, allowing his friend whatever comfort the theory provided. The journalist from Baltimore appeared again in June 1854, this time in Richmond, asking questions at the customs house about travel north in early 1853. He specifically inquired about a couple matching Catherine and Samuel's description who might have traveled by train or coach. The customs officials reported his inquiries to Virginia's governor, who ordered an investigation into the man's background. What they discovered was troubling. The journalist was not a journalist at all, but a lawyer from Pennsylvania, retained by an unnamed client to investigate the circumstances of Samuel's death. The lawyer, when confronted, claimed attorney-client privilege and refused to explain who had retained him or why. Virginia authorities, lacking jurisdiction, could do nothing but warn him against continuing his inquiries in their state. The lawyer left Virginia but continued his investigation from Pennsylvania. His reports, filed with his mysterious client, documented a pattern that would only become clear years later. Samuel had not been a random target for Underground Railroad recruitment, but had been specifically sought out, contacted, and assisted because of his unique position at Dunmore Hall. Someone had known that Samuel was literate, that he had access to plantation records, that he worked closely with the master's daughter. Someone had arranged contact with him, had provided advice on planning the escape, had coordinated assistance along their route north. The question was why? What made this particular escape worth the investment of time and resources that Underground Railroad operators usually reserved for larger groups or politically significant cases? The answer lay in a letter Samuel had written but never sent. The letter hidden in the wall of his office, addressed to the person who had made everything possible. But that letter remained undiscovered, and so the pattern remained incomplete. In Philadelphia, Catherine received a visit in July 1854 from a well-dressed black man who introduced himself as a minister and friend of Samuel's. He expressed condolences on Samuel's death and asked if there was anything she needed. Catherine, suspicious of unexpected visitors, was nonetheless moved by his obvious sincerity. She admitted that she was managing but that life was difficult. The minister, his name was Reverend Theodore Jenkins, returned a week later with a proposal. A family he knew, Quakers living in Lancaster County, needed a governess for their 3 daughters. They were aware of Catherine's circumstances and were willing to employ her, providing a cottage on their property where she and Sarah could live. The position would include meals, a modest salary, and education for Sarah when she was old enough. Catherine accepted gratefully, and by August 1854, she and Sarah had moved to Lancaster County, to a small stone cottage on the property of Isaac and Rebecca Norton, prosperous farmers whose commitment to abolition was matched by their commitment to practical assistance. For the next 3 years, Catherine lived there in relative stability, teaching the Norton daughters, helping Rebecca with household tasks, and raising Sarah in an environment that, while not without its challenges, was fundamentally kind. But Reverend Jenkins's interest in her welfare was not purely charitable. He visited occasionally, always bringing small gifts for Sarah, always asking careful questions about Catherine's life in Virginia, about Samuel, about the circumstances of their escape. Catherine, lonely and grateful for adult conversation, gradually shared more than she intended. Jenkins was particularly interested in Samuel's role at Dunmore Hall, in his access to records and correspondence. He asked whether Samuel had ever mentioned seeing documents related to slave purchases, sales, or transfers. He asked whether Colonel Dunmore had corresponded with certain names Catherine didn't recognize but wrote down at Jenkins's request, promising to let him know if she remembered hearing them. Only later, years later, would Catherine understand what Jenkins had really been asking. But in 1854 and 1855, she simply appreciated his friendship and never questioned his motives. Back in Virginia, Colonel Dunmore's health continued to deteriorate. The persistent cough developed into something more serious, diagnosed by his physician as consumption. By 1856, he rarely left his bedchamber, conducting business through written instructions delivered by Mrs. Hawthorne to his overseer. On a humid August evening in 1856, with thunder rumbling in the distance, Colonel Dunmore summoned Magistrate Howell to his bedside. What he said during that final conversation, Howell never fully recorded, but his journal entry that night notes, "James asked me to burn all the documents, to let the matter die with him. I promised I would consider it. I did not promise I would comply. Some truths are too important to burn, even when they bring only pain." Colonel Dunmore died 3 days later. His funeral was attended by everyone of importance in Mecklenburg County, and the eulogies praised his integrity, his business acumen, his devotion to Virginia. Catherine's name was not mentioned. No one suggested that he had left any unacknowledged heirs. His will, read a week after the funeral, distributed his property among various nephews and cousins. Dunmore Hall went to a nephew who had worked as his overseer. The enslaved population was divided among several heirs. Everything was orderly, proper, and exactly as Virginia law prescribed. But tucked into the back of Colonel Dunmore's personal Bible, found by Mrs. Hawthorne as she was packing his effects, was a single sheet of paper in his handwriting. She brought it to Magistrate Howell without reading it. Howell opened it in his office, alone, and found himself reading something he had never expected. A letter to Catherine written but never sent, dated June 1856. It began, "My daughter," and continued for 2 pages, detailing Colonel Dunmore's regrets, his acknowledgement that she had been right to choose as she did, his wish that he had been strong enough to acknowledge his granddaughter, his sorrow at the life his pride had cost them all. The letter ended, "I cannot undo what I have done, and I am too old and sick to change course now. But I want you to know that not a day has passed since March 1853 that I have not thought of you, prayed for you, and grieved for the daughter I lost to my own stubbornness. Tell my granddaughter, if you think it wise, that her grandfather loved her even though he never knew her, and that love was not strong enough to overcome fear. May you both forgive me, though I cannot forgive myself." Magistrate Howell read the letter twice, then locked it in his safe with the other documents. He never sent it to Catherine. He recorded in his journal, "What purpose would it serve now? James is dead. Catherine has built a life in Pennsylvania. Better to let them both have peace. But I cannot destroy this. Someone someday should know that he regretted, that he loved, that he failed himself as much as he failed her." The letter joined the growing collection of documents that told a story no one alive fully understood. Letters, unfinished notes, cryptic messages suggesting coordination and planning that went beyond what Catherine and Samuel could have managed alone. Together they formed pieces of a puzzle whose complete picture remained obscured by time, death, and deliberate concealment. And still hidden in that wall in Samuel's old office, waiting for the renovation that wouldn't come for another 58 years, was the final piece. Samuel's letter, explaining who had helped them, why, and what the true purpose of their escape had been beyond the obvious. That letter would change everything once it was finally discovered. But for now, in 1856, it remained sealed in its tin box, its secrets intact. The years following Colonel Dunmore's death brought relative calm to the surface narrative. Catherine continued her work as governess. Sarah grew from infant to child, and in Virginia the scandal faded into local legend, the kind of story elderly people would mention occasionally, always with shaking heads, always emphasizing different lessons depending on their audience. But beneath this apparent calm, several threads were pulling tight, drawing toward a revelation none of the participants anticipated. The first thread involved Reverend Theodore Jenkins. In 1857, he visited Catherine for the last time, bringing news that shook her carefully constructed peace. Samuel, he revealed, had not been simply a random contact for the Underground Railroad, but had been specifically recruited for a purpose Catherine had never fully understood. Jenkins explained, in 1851, rumors had reached abolitionist networks in Philadelphia that a major slave-trading ring was operating out of Virginia, purchasing enslaved people in the Upper South and illegally transporting them to Cuba and Brazil, where slavery remained legal and prices were higher. The ring was supposedly documented in letters and ledgers kept at several major plantations, including Dunmore Hall. Samuel, with his literacy and access to Colonel Dunmore's correspondence, had been identified as someone who might be able to gather evidence. Jenkins had made contact with him in late 1851, explaining the situation and asking if Samuel could copy any relevant documents he encountered. Samuel agreed, Jenkins said quietly, watching Catherine's face. He spent months looking through correspondence, copying anything that seemed relevant. He was going to escape anyway. He had told me that from the start, but he was willing to help us first. Catherine felt the room tilt. The letters we exchanged, she said slowly. The plans we made, were those real or was I part of his mission? Jenkins looked pained. Catherine, I promise you this. Samuel's feelings for you were entirely genuine. He spoke of you constantly with such tenderness. The original plan was for him to escape alone after gathering the evidence. But when he realized you were pregnant, when you insisted on going with him, he changed everything. He took enormous risks to bring you safely north, risks that had nothing to do with our mission. What evidence did he gather? Jenkins hesitated. Letters proving that your father was corresponding with men involved in the illegal slave trade, though we could never determine if he was participant or victim. The correspondence suggested that someone was using Dunmore Hall's legitimate business to hide illegal activities. Samuel copied dozens of letters before your escape. He brought them north with him. Where are they now? That's why I'm here. Jenkins leaned forward. Samuel gave them to me 2 days before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should keep them safe and decide whether to use them. I've spent 3 years trying to verify the information to build a case. But Catherine, the letters mention your father directly. Publishing them would destroy what remains of his reputation. Catherine sat in silence for a long time, Sarah playing quietly at her feet. Finally, she said, My father destroyed his own reputation by rejecting his daughter and granddaughter. If Samuel died gathering that evidence, if it can stop others from suffering as we did, then publish it. Jenkins nodded slowly. There's more you should know. The lawyer who investigated Samuel's death, the one who came to Virginia asking questions, he was hired by one of the men mentioned in the correspondence. They wanted to know how much Samuel had discovered, whether the evidence reached us. That's why the investigation stopped so abruptly after your father's death. They assumed the documents had died with him. Are we in danger? I don't believe so. You're too visible now, too connected to abolitionist circles. Harming you would create exactly the kind of attention they want to avoid. But you should know the truth about what you and Samuel were caught up in." After Jenkins left, Catherine sat in the cottage for hours, Sarah finally asleep in her arms, trying to reconcile the romance she had believed in with the political mission she hadn't known existed. Had Samuel used her? Or had he loved her despite the mission? Could both be true simultaneously? She never reached a satisfying answer. But she wrote to Jenkins a week later, reiterating her permission to publish the documents. If Samuel's death meant anything, it had to mean that the truth mattered more than reputation. The second thread involved the Norton family. In 1858, Isaac Norton, the Quaker farmer who had given Catherine sanctuary, suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. Rebecca, overwhelmed with managing the farm and caring for her husband, suggested that Catherine might want to seek a position elsewhere, somewhere more stable. It was kindly meant, but Catherine understood the subtext. The Nortons could no longer afford to keep her. She began inquiring about other positions, but 5 years had passed since her escape from Virginia, and her story was now too well known in Pennsylvania abolitionist circles. Potential employers saw her as a symbol, a cause, rather than simply a capable governess and teacher. She was facing potential destitution for the second time when a letter arrived from Boston. A women's seminary, run by abolitionists, offered her a position teaching French and music. The salary was modest, but it included housing, and Sarah would be able to attend the school when she was old enough. Catherine accepted immediately, and by November 1858, she and Sarah had moved to Boston, to a small apartment near the seminary. Boston was different from Pennsylvania, larger, busier, more intellectual, and more radical. Catherine found herself, for the first time since leaving Virginia, in a community that didn't simply tolerate her story but celebrated it. She was invited to speak at abolitionist gatherings, always declining. She was asked to write about her experiences, always refusing. She wanted only to be left alone to teach and raise her daughter. But history was not done with Catherine Dunmore. The third thread began pulling tight in 1859 when Reverend Jenkins finally published the documents Samuel had gathered, along with a detailed article explaining their significance. The publication created a scandal that rippled through Virginia and beyond. The documents proved that a network of traders had been using legitimate plantation correspondence to coordinate illegal slave exports to Cuba. Several prominent Virginia planters were implicated, including, most damaging, several who had publicly advocated for secession and Southern rights. The political implications were explosive. Colonel Dunmore's role remained ambiguous in the documents. He had corresponded with the men involved, but whether he had known about the illegal aspects was unclear. Some letters suggested he might have been investigating the scheme himself. Others implied he was complicit. Jenkins, in his article, gave Dunmore the benefit of doubt, suggesting he had been an unwitting tool of more sophisticated criminals. But the damage was done. In Virginia, the Dunmore name became associated with scandal. The nephew who had inherited Dunmore Hall sold it quickly, at a loss, and moved to Maryland. Mrs. Hawthorne, now elderly and living with a niece, refused to discuss the case, though she wept when shown Jenkins' article. Magistrate Howell, reading the article in his office, realized with growing horror that the story he had thought he understood was far more complex than he had known. Samuel hadn't simply been a runaway in love. He had been gathering intelligence that powerful men wanted to suppress. Catherine hadn't just been a rebellious daughter. She had been caught up in a conspiracy that reached far beyond Mecklenburg County. Howell retrieved the sealed documents from his safe and read through them again, this time looking for connections to Jenkins' revelations. He found them. Names mentioned in the letters matched names in the illegal trade network. Dates aligned. The pieces that had seemed random now formed a pattern. But questions remained. How had Samuel initially been contacted by Jenkins? How had the Underground Railroad known about Samuel's position at Dunmore Hall? And most troublingly, had Catherine's pregnancy been genuine, or had it been a convenient excuse to justify her joining Samuel's escape? Howell never voiced this last question aloud, but it haunted him. His journals from 1859 show a man increasingly troubled by the complexity of what he had witnessed, increasingly uncertain about the nature of truth itself. In Boston, Catherine read Jenkins' article with mixed emotions: pride that Samuel's sacrifice had meant something, grief at seeing her father's name dragged through controversy again, and a deep, unsettling uncertainty about the man she had loved. How much had he told her? How much had he concealed? Had their entire relationship been, in some sense, a mission he was executing while genuinely caring for her? She never learned the answer, because the fourth thread, the one that might have resolved everything, remained hidden. Samuel's final letter, the one sealed in the wall of his old office at Dunmore Hall, contained the truth about his initial contact with Jenkins, about his motivations, and about the genuine surprise he felt when his strategic escape plan intersected with his impossible love for Catherine. That letter would have explained that he had agreed to gather evidence before he knew Catherine, that he had planned to escape alone after completing his mission, that falling in love with her had complicated everything, that choosing to bring her north had meant abandoning his escape timetable and taking risks Jenkins had never approved. The letter would have proven that his love was real, even though it existed alongside his political mission. But the letter remained hidden, and so Catherine lived with doubt, never quite certain whether she had been loved or used, whether their shared sacrifice had been mutual, or whether she had been a convenient cover for espionage. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in this story intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in Catherine's troubled journey. The final thread began pulling in the autumn of 1859, when a man appeared at the Boston Seminary asking to see Catherine. He gave his name as William Crenshaw, claimed to be a historian researching the Underground Railroad, and seemed harmless enough that Catherine agreed to meet him in the seminary's parlor with the headmistress present. Crenshaw was polite, methodical, and deeply knowledgeable about the details of her case. He asked questions about Samuel's work at Dunmore Hall, about the documents he had gathered, about the timing of their escape. Catherine answered carefully, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the specificity of his interest. Finally, she asked directly, "Why are you really here, Mr. Crenshaw?" Crenshaw hesitated, then said quietly, "Because Samuel wasn't working alone at Dunmore Hall. Someone else was feeding him information, telling him which documents to copy, which correspondence to preserve. Someone who knew the illegal trade network from the inside. I'm trying to identify that person." Catherine felt her breath catch. "Who do you think it was?" "I don't know. But I believe it was someone in your father's household, someone with access to information Samuel couldn't have obtained on his own. Someone who, after Samuel's escape, continued to pass information to abolitionist networks, right up until your father's death." The implications were staggering. If Crenshaw was right, then someone at Dunmore Hall, Mrs. Hawthorne, Taggart before his dismissal, another enslaved person, one of the field overseers, had been operating as an informant, using Samuel as the courier for information they gathered. "Why are you telling me this?" Crenshaw leaned forward. "Because I think Samuel left evidence somewhere, something that would identify his contact. And I think you might know where it is, even if you don't realize what you know." Catherine searched her memory but found nothing helpful. The few possessions Samuel had brought north with them had been lost after his death, sold or discarded in her desperate poverty. If he had hidden evidence, she didn't know where. Crenshaw left disappointed, but he had planted a seed of doubt that grew rapidly. If Samuel had been receiving inside information, if someone else at Dunmore Hall had been working against the illegal trade network, then the entire story needed to be reconsidered. Samuel and Catherine's escape hadn't been an isolated act of rebellion. but part of a larger pattern of resistance, one that had continued even after they fled. This realization would have been revelatory, transformative, revolutionary, except that it was still incomplete. The missing piece, Samuel's letter, would have named his inside contact, explained how they had communicated, and revealed the full scope of the operation that had been running underneath Colonel Dunmore's nose for years. But that letter stayed hidden, the truth it contained sealed behind plaster and wood, waiting for a renovation that still lay decades in the future. In December 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and the fragile peace that had held the nation together began its final collapse. Catherine, watching from Boston as the country slid toward war, felt the peculiar sensation of vindication mixed with horror. Everything Samuel had warned about, everything they had discussed in their hidden conversations, was coming true. Sarah, now 7 years old, was old enough to understand that something important was happening, though not old enough to fully grasp what it meant. She asked questions. Why were people angry? Why was there going to be war? Catherine answered as honestly as she could, explaining about slavery, about the irreconcilable differences between North and South, about the economic and moral cataclysm approaching. "Is that why you left Virginia?" Sarah asked one evening. "Because you knew this was coming?" Catherine considered the question carefully. "Your father knew it was coming. He tried to explain it to me, but I didn't fully understand until later. We left for many reasons, but yes, this conflict was part of what we were fleeing." In April 1861, Fort Sumter fell and the war began. Catherine followed the news obsessively, reading about battles fought in Virginia, about plantations burned or occupied, about the enslaved populations fleeing to Union lines. She wondered what had become of Dunmore Hall, whether the people she had once known were still alive, still enslaved, or had found freedom in the chaos. The seminary became a center of war relief efforts. Catherine organized fundraising events, rolled bandages, and helped coordinate supplies for contraband camps where formerly enslaved people gathered behind Union lines. It was exhausting work, but it gave her purpose and distracted her from the growing unease she felt about the past. That unease crystallized in June 1861 when she received a letter from Magistrate Howell. He wrote that Dunmore Hall had been abandoned when Virginia seceded, the nephew who owned it having fled to avoid the fighting. Union forces now controlled the area, and he had arranged for the documents he had been holding, the letters between Catherine and Samuel, the unfinished note about her pregnancy, Colonel Dunmore's unsent letter to her, to be transferred to Boston for safekeeping. "I am old now," Howell wrote, "and I believe these should be in your possession, not mine. The war has made all our old certainties irrelevant. Perhaps it is time for the complete truth to emerge, whatever that truth might be." The documents arrived in August, carefully sealed in a leather portfolio. Catherine opened them alone in her apartment after Sarah had gone to bed and spent the night reading through papers she had never seen. Her own letters to Samuel returned to her like messages from a ghost. Samuel's replies, with their careful coded language, her father's final words to her, never sent, acknowledging regret too late. She wept, not from sadness but from the overwhelming complexity of emotion the documents evoked. Love, grief, anger, forgiveness, all tangled together, impossible to separate. She had built a life on the foundation of believing her choice had been right, but seeing her father's letter of regret made her wonder about all the other possibilities, all the other paths not taken. In October 1861, Catherine received an unexpected visitor, William Crenshaw, the historian who had questioned her 2 years earlier. He looked older, worn, urgent. "I've found something," he said without preamble. "At Dunmore Hall, the Union Army is using it as a headquarters, and they're renovating one of the buildings. They found a hidden space in the wall of what was once an office. There was a tin box inside, with a letter." Catherine's heart began to race. "A letter from Samuel?" "Yes, addressed to someone at the plantation, someone he was working with." "Catherine, This changes everything we thought we knew. Crenshaw produced a copy of the letter, the original being held by military authorities. Catherine read it with shaking hands. "Friend, this will be my final communication before the attempt. The evidence we have gathered will go north with me. C has insisted on coming. I tried to dissuade her, but she is resolute. I cannot in conscience leave her to face the consequences of what we have discovered. Her father is not complicit, but he is in danger from those who are. You must remain behind and continue watching. The correspondence we found suggests the illegal trade will intensify before collapsing. Document everything. Someone must survive to testify. If I am captured or killed before reaching safety, know that I would make the same choice again. What we have done matters more than individual lives. But I confess, and forgive me for this weakness, that leaving you and the others behind tears at my heart. We have built something here, a network of resistance operating in the very heart of the system we oppose. You have been braver than I could ever be, staying when I run. Continue the work, free those you can, document what you cannot prevent. One day, this will matter. Remember what we discussed, the third barrel in the north cellar, beneath the false bottom. Everything I could not carry is there. Use it as you see fit. Your brother in struggle, Samuel." Catherine read the letter 3 times, her mind reeling. Samuel had not been working alone. Someone at Dunmore Hall had been his partner, his contact, his co-conspirator. Someone who had stayed behind after his escape, who had continued gathering evidence, who had risked everything while Samuel and Catherine fled north. "Who was it?" Catherine whispered. "Who was he writing to?" "We don't know," Crenshaw admitted. The letter wasn't addressed by name, but whoever it was remained at Dunmore Hall for at least several more years because we found additional documents in the cellar barrel he mentioned. Evidence gathered between 1853 and 1856, right up until your father's death. Catherine thought frantically through the people who had been at Dunmore Hall when she left. Mrs. Hawthorne. Impossible. She was white, elderly, completely conventional. Taggart. He had been dismissed shortly after their escape. One of the enslaved workers. But which one? Samuel had kept himself apart from the others, hadn't seemed close to anyone. Then a memory surfaced. Samuel, late one evening, having a quiet conversation near the slave quarters with someone Catherine couldn't quite see in the darkness. She had thought nothing of it at the time, had assumed it was plantation business. But what if it had been something else? The documents in the cellar? Catherine asked. What did they prove? Crenshaw's expression grew grim. That the illegal trade was far larger than we suspected. That it involved not just plantation owners but bankers, shipping companies and government officials. That the profits were used to fund pro-slavery political campaigns. The evidence is overwhelming. It will be used in war trials after the Union victory. If there's a Union victory, there will be. The North has resources the South cannot match. But Catherine, this means Samuel's death wasn't in vain. He gathered enough evidence to help dismantle a criminal network that enslaved thousands. His mysterious partner gathered even more. Together, they created a record that will ensure justice. Catherine sat in silence, trying to absorb the implications. Samuel had been a spy, yes, but also a believer in documentation, in testimony, in the power of evidence to change systems. His love for her had been real. The letters proved that. But it had existed alongside a commitment to something larger than either of them. I need to know who helped him, Catherine said finally. Who risked everything and stayed behind. They deserve recognition, acknowledgement. They may not want it, Crenshaw interrupted gently. Whoever they were, they survived by remaining invisible. The war has freed most of Virginia's enslaved population, but old hatreds die slowly. Coming forward might still be dangerous. Over the following weeks, Catherine became obsessed with identifying Samuel's unnamed partner. She wrote to Mrs. Hawthorne, who replied with a brief note saying she remembered nothing helpful and wished to be left in peace. She wrote to the Union commander occupying Dunmore Hall, asking if any of the formerly enslaved people there remembered Samuel or had information about his activities. The responses were frustrating. Some people remembered Samuel as aloof and educated, but no one admitted to working with him. One elderly woman wrote that Samuel had sometimes helped people with letters and documents, but she knew nothing about any spying. A man who had worked in the stables remembered seeing Samuel meet occasionally with someone near the tobacco barns, but he couldn't recall who. The mystery remained unsolved as the war ground on through 1862 and 1863. Catherine continued her relief work, raised Sarah, and taught at the seminary. But part of her mind was always circling back to that letter, to the unnamed friend who had been brave enough to stay when Samuel fled. In July 1863, news of Gettysburg reached Boston, and with it came a flood of wounded soldiers, contraband refugees, and stories of Confederate defeat. Among the refugees, a group of formerly enslaved people from Virginia who had made their way north following the Union Army. Catherine, volunteering at the refugee center, found herself face to face with someone she recognized. A woman named Ruth, who had worked in the Dunmore Hall kitchen, who had been perhaps 40 in 1853 and was now 50. They stared at each other for a long moment before Ruth spoke. "Miss Catherine, they said you was dead." "I'm not," Catherine replied quietly. "Are you alone?" "My children are free now. That's all that matters." Catherine helped Ruth get settled, found her temporary housing, and arranged for food and clothes. 2 days later, she visited Ruth privately and asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Ruth, did you know Samuel was gathering evidence against the illegal slave traders?" Ruth's face became carefully blank. "I knew Samuel did the master's paperwork. I found a letter he wrote addressed to someone he was working with. Someone who stayed at Dunmore Hall after we left and continued gathering information." "Ruth, if you know anything—" "I don't know nothing about that," Ruth said firmly. But her eyes told a different story, and Catherine pressed gently. "Whoever helped him deserves recognition. Their evidence helped bring down a criminal network. I just want to know—" "Leave it alone," Ruth interrupted, her voice suddenly hard. "Some things are better not dug up. The past is past. We're free now. That's enough." Catherine wanted to argue, but recognized the fear in Ruth's eyes. Even in freedom, even in the North, old terrors remained. She let the matter drop. But that evening, Ruth appeared at Catherine's apartment, alone, after Sarah had been put to bed. She stood in the doorway, trembling slightly, and said, "It wasn't Samuel's idea. It was mine." Catherine led Ruth inside, poured her tea with shaking hands, and listened as the woman she had known only as a kitchen servant revealed a story that transformed everything. Ruth had been born free in Delaware, the daughter of a ship carpenter. She had been kidnapped at 15, sold south, and eventually purchased by Colonel Dunmore in 1840. She had spent 13 years in the Dunmore Hall kitchen, keeping her literacy secret, biding her time, and slowly building connections with other enslaved people throughout the region. When Samuel arrived in 1849, Ruth explained, "I recognized what he was immediately. Educated, careful, positioned where he could see things. I watched him for a year before making contact. He was planning to run anyway. He told me that straight away, but I convinced him to gather evidence first." "Why?" Catherine asked. "Why risk so much?" "Because running saves one person. Evidence saves hundreds." Ruth's voice was fierce. "I couldn't run. I had children, family, but I could document. I could copy. I could make sure that when freedom came, we'd have proof of what had been done to us." She explained the system they had developed. Ruth would identify important correspondence, would listen to conversations between Colonel Dunmore and his visitors, would note names and dates. Samuel would access the documents, make copies, and pass them to Underground Railroad contacts during his occasional trips to town on plantation business. "When you started spending time with him," Ruth continued, "I warned him to be careful. But love don't listen to warnings. By the time you were pregnant, he was desperate to protect you. The plan was for him to run alone, but he couldn't leave you behind. Did you help us escape? I made sure the night watchman took a longer route that night. I made sure Mrs. Hawthorne's sleeping draft was strong. I made sure the dogs were fed and calm. You didn't escape despite the plantation, Miss Catherine. You escaped because the plantation let you go. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. Why didn't you tell me? Because the fewer people knew, the safer everyone was. After you left, I continued the work. Your father never suspected. When Taggart got too close to figuring things out, I made sure he was dismissed. I kept copying, kept documenting, kept building the case until your father died. Then I sealed everything in that cellar barrel and waited. Why reveal yourself now? Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Because I'm dying. The doctor says I have maybe a year, and I wanted someone to know that Samuel didn't do it alone. That the intelligence, the planning, the network, a lot of that came from people who stayed behind. We couldn't all run, but we could all fight. Over the following months, as Ruth's health declined, Catherine recorded her testimony in detail. Ruth identified dozens of enslaved people who had participated in the documentation network, who had risked everything to gather evidence while appearing to submit. She named the free black contacts who had helped coordinate information sharing. She revealed hiding places where additional evidence might still be found. Most importantly, she explained that Samuel's love for Catherine had been real, but had complicated a mission that had been years in development. He was torn, Ruth said. He wanted to complete the work, but he wanted to save you more. In the end, he chose both, and maybe that's why he didn't survive. He pushed himself too hard, risked too much because he was trying to do everything at once. Ruth died in February 1864, just after the birth of Sarah's younger brother. Catherine had remarried quietly in 1862 to a Boston teacher, a kind man who accepted her past without judgment. Ruth's funeral was small but attended by several dozen formerly enslaved people from Virginia who had made their way north. They sang hymns Ruth had taught them, and they shared stories of her courage, her intelligence, and her absolutely ruthless commitment to freedom. Catherine arranged for Ruth's testimony to be published in abolitionist newspapers, crediting her by name as the architect of the documentation network that had exposed the illegal slave trade. Some newspapers ran the story. Others buried it, uncomfortable with the idea that an enslaved woman had been the mastermind behind an intelligence operation that had fooled Virginia's planter class for years. But the evidence Ruth and Samuel had gathered was used extensively in war trials and post-war prosecutions. Several men involved in the illegal trade were convicted, their property seized, their reputations destroyed. The documentation network they had created became a model for understanding how enslaved people had resisted the system from within, how they had maintained communication and cooperation despite every obstacle. In 1865, when the war ended and slavery was abolished, Catherine took Sarah, now 12 years old and precociously intelligent, back to Virginia for the first time. They visited the ruins of Dunmore Hall, which had been partially burned during the fighting. The main house still stood, occupied by a Union officer as temporary headquarters. Catherine walked through the office where Samuel had worked, the kitchen where Ruth had labored, the fields where so many people had suffered. She stood in the room that had been her bedroom and tried to recall the young woman she had been, the person who had thought fleeing with Samuel would solve everything. She understood now that it had solved almost nothing. Their escape had been one small act of resistance in a war that had required millions of such acts. Samuel had died, Ruth had died, her father had died, refusing to acknowledge his grandchild. The system they had all been part of had collapsed, but the costs had been almost unimaginable. Was it worth it? Sarah asked, standing beside her mother in the abandoned office. Catherine considered the question carefully. I don't know if it was worth what it cost, but I know it was necessary. Some systems can't be reformed from within. They have to be broken, even if the breaking destroys people we love. They visited Magistrate Howell, now elderly and frail, living with his daughter. He was happy to see Catherine, less happy to discuss the past. But he brought out his journals and let her read them, let her see how he had struggled with conscience, with loyalty, with the impossibility of being a good man in a bad system. I did what I thought was right, he said. But I was wrong more often than I was right. Your father was wrong. Samuel and Ruth were right, but they paid for being right with their lives. The only one who got away unscathed was me, and that's because I did nothing when I should have done everything. Catherine returned to Boston in June 1865, carrying with her the journals Howell had given her, the documents that told the full story of the network that had operated beneath Virginia's Plantation Society. She spent the next 20 years organizing these materials, preparing them for archive, ensuring that Ruth's name and the names of all the others who had resisted would be remembered. Sarah grew up, graduated from the seminary where her mother taught, and became a teacher herself. She married a minister, had 3 children, and lived to see the 20th century arrive. She never met her grandfather or knew her father, but she knew their stories, and she made sure her own children knew them too. Catherine lived until 1891, dying at 61 from pneumonia. Her obituary in the Boston newspapers mentioned her early life in Virginia, her work at the seminary, and her contributions to the abolitionist cause. It did not mention the scandal of 1853, the forbidden love that had shocked Virginia society. That story had been absorbed into larger narratives of the Civil War, becoming just one of thousands of tales about slavery's human costs. But the documents remained, sealed in archives, waiting for historians who would eventually discover them and reconstruct the story. The letters between Catherine and Samuel would become famous in academic circles, studied as evidence of how enslaved people maintained literacy and interior lives despite oppression. Ruth's testimony would be cited in books about slave resistance. Colonel Dunmore's final letter would be used to illustrate the psychological costs of maintaining an unjust system. And in 1914, when a renovation of what remained of Dunmore Hall finally revealed Samuel's hidden letter to Ruth, the complete story would finally emerge, confirming what Catherine had long suspected, that their escape had been part of something larger, that love and resistance had been intertwined, that the bravest people involved had been those who stayed behind rather than those who fled. The letter changed academic understanding of the Underground Railroad, demonstrating that information networks had been as important as escape routes, that documentation had been a form of resistance as vital as flight. It proved that enslaved people had been active agents of their own liberation, not passive victims waiting for white saviors. But by 1914, everyone involved was dead. Catherine, Samuel, Ruth, Colonel Dunmore, Magistrate Howell, all gone, their choices and consequences absorbed into history. Their story became a footnote in larger narratives about slavery's end, significant to scholars but largely unknown to the general public. Until now, when documents unsealed by court order and family permission have allowed the full story to be told for the first time. The letters, the testimonies, the evidence of the network that operated for years under Virginia's nose, all of it available now for examination and judgment. This mystery shows us that history is never simple, that love and resistance can coexist, that individuals making impossible choices can sometimes change systems even as those systems destroy them. The story of Catherine and Samuel asks us to consider, what would you sacrifice for freedom? What risks would you take for love? And how do we honor those who stayed and fought from within as much as those who fled and fought from outside? What do you think of this story? Do you believe Catherine and Samuel made the right choice? Do you think Ruth's network was more important than individual escapes? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.